In the heart of the Colorado Rockies, where nature's beauty masks its deadliest secrets, lies one of America's most baffling mysteries. A family of 4 boarded a helicopter on a sunny Tuesday morning. They were never seen again. The helicopter's rotors sliced through the crisp mountain air as the Morrison family embarked on what was supposed to be a routine scenic flight over the Colorado Rockies. Sarah Morrison gripped her husband David's hand as their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, pressed their faces against the windows, marveling at the breathtaking landscape below. The experienced pilot, Captain James Reynolds, had flown this route hundreds of times, but something felt different that October morning in 2019. "Look, Mom, you can see our house from here," 8-year-old Emma squealed with delight, pointing toward the valley below. Her sister Sophie nodded enthusiastically, her blonde curls bouncing as she tried to get a better view. Sarah smiled at her daughter's excitement, temporarily forgetting the unease that had been gnawing at her since they'd left the helipad. David Morrison, a successful architect from Denver, had booked this helicopter tour as a surprise for his wife's 35th birthday. He'd wanted to show her the mountains from a perspective she'd never seen before, to create a memory that would last a lifetime. Little did he know that this flight would indeed create a memory that would haunt everyone involved, but not in the way he had intended. Captain Reynolds adjusted his headset and spoke into the microphone with practiced calm. "We're approaching Eagles Peak now, folks. On your left, you'll see the famous Devil's Canyon. The rock formations there are over 2 million years old." His voice carried the confidence of someone who had given this same speech countless times before, but those who knew him well might have detected a slight tremor that hadn't been there in previous flights. The Morrison family had no way of knowing that within the next hour they would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would torment investigators for years to come. The helicopter would be found 3 days later, perfectly intact in a remote mountain clearing, but the family would be gone as if they had simply evaporated into the thin mountain air. Sarah Morrison was a pediatric nurse at Denver Children's Hospital, known for her compassionate care and unwavering dedication to her young patients. Her colleagues described her as someone who would never abandon her responsibilities, someone who lived for her family and her work. The idea that she would simply walk away from her life was incomprehensible to everyone who knew her. David had built his architectural firm from the ground up, designing some of Denver's most recognizable buildings. He was methodical, organized, and deeply devoted to his wife and daughters. His business partner, Michael Chen, would later tell investigators that David had seemed distracted in the weeks leading up to the flight, but nothing that would suggest he was planning to disappear. The twins, Emma and Sophie, were honor students at their elementary school, popular with their classmates and actively involved in soccer and piano lessons. Their teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, remembered them as bright, happy children who talked constantly about their family's upcoming adventures. There was nothing in their behavior to suggest they knew they were about to vanish from the world they knew. As the helicopter continued its journey through the mountains, Captain Reynolds pointed out various landmarks, his voice steady despite the growing turbulence. The weather report had called for clear skies, but mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable. Dark clouds were beginning to gather around the higher peaks, and the wind was picking up in ways that made even an experienced pilot like Reynolds feel uneasy. "Are we going to fly through those clouds?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible over the rotor noise. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The helicopter seemed to be flying lower than she had expected, and she could see Reynolds checking his instruments more frequently than seemed normal. David leaned forward to get a better view of the approaching weather system. As an architect, he understood the importance of reading environmental conditions, and what he saw made him uncomfortable. The clouds weren't just dark, they seemed to be moving in patterns that defied the wind direction. He wanted to say something to the pilot, but he didn't want to alarm his family or seem like he was questioning a professional's judgment. The helicopter's GPS system showed their location as approximately 30 miles northeast of Aspen, flying over terrain that was largely uninhabited, except for the occasional hiking trail or abandoned mining operation. This area of the Colorado Rockies was known for its sudden weather changes and treacherous flying conditions, but Reynolds had navigated these mountains for over 15 years without incident. At exactly 10:47 a.m., according to the flight recorder that would later be recovered, Reynolds made radio contact with air traffic control. "Denver Control, this is November 784 Charlie. We're experiencing some unusual weather patterns up here. Requesting permission to alter course to avoid the cloud formation ahead." The response came back clear and immediate. 784 Charlie, you are cleared to adjust heading as needed. Keep us informed of your status. That was the last communication anyone would receive from the helicopter. At 10:52 a.m., the aircraft simply vanished from radar screens, leaving air traffic controllers staring at empty displays where the blip representing the Morrison family had been just moments before. Initial attempts to re-establish contact were met with static, then nothing but the eerie silence of dead air. Sarah Morrison's sister, Jennifer, was the first to realize something was wrong. She had been expecting a call from Sarah around noon, a tradition they maintained whenever Sarah went on family outings. When her phone remained silent, Jennifer initially dismissed it as her sister being caught up in the excitement of the helicopter tour. But, as the afternoon wore on without any word, a cold dread began to settle in her stomach. By 3 p.m., when the helicopter was officially overdue, Jennifer had called the tour company, Morrison Aerial Adventures, owned and operated by Captain Reynolds and his business partner. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelly, tried to remain calm as she explained that they had lost contact with the aircraft, but that this wasn't necessarily cause for immediate alarm. Mountain flying often involved communication blackouts, and experienced pilots like Reynolds knew how to handle unexpected situations. But as the hours passed and darkness began to fall over the mountains, it became clear that this was no ordinary communication failure. The Colorado National Guard launched a search and rescue operation at first light the following morning, deploying multiple helicopters and ground teams to comb the vast wilderness where the Morrison family had last been seen. The search area covered over 500 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain in North America. Steep cliffs, dense forests, and unpredictable weather made the operation dangerous for the rescuers themselves. Search teams rappelled into canyons, hiked through areas that hadn't seen human footprints in decades, and used thermal imaging equipment to scan for any signs of life or wreckage. On the second day of the search, a breakthrough came when a ground team spotted something metallic, reflecting sunlight from a clearing approximately 40 miles from the helicopter's last known position. The discovery site was accessible only by foot, requiring a 3-hour hike through dense forest and rocky terrain. What the search team found when they reached the clearing would baffle investigators for years to come. The helicopter sat in the center of the clearing, as if it had been gently placed there by invisible hands. The aircraft was completely intact, with no signs of a crash landing or mechanical failure. The rotors had stopped in a normal position, the landing gear was properly deployed, and there wasn't even a scratch on the fuselage. It looked as though Captain Reynolds had simply decided to land in this remote location and shut down the engines, but the helicopter was empty. The Morrison family and Captain Reynolds had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their personal belongings and a series of clues that raised more questions than they answered. Sarah's purse was still in her seat, containing her wallet, phone, and a half-eaten granola bar. David's camera was on the floor, its memory card full of photos from their flight, the last image time-stamped at 10:51 a.m. The twins' backpacks were still in their seats, containing coloring books, small toys, and the sandwiches Sarah had packed for the flight. Everything suggested that the family had simply stepped out of the helicopter and walked away, but the surrounding area showed no footprints, no signs of struggle, and no indication of where 5 people could have gone in the middle of the wilderness. Detective Maria Rodriguez of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation was assigned to lead the missing persons case. A 15-year veteran of law enforcement with extensive experience in mountain rescues and missing persons investigations, Rodriguez had seen her share of unusual cases, but nothing quite like this. The absence of any physical evidence at the scene was unprecedented in her experience. In 30 years of search and rescue operations, "I've never seen anything like this," stated Tom Bradley, the lead search coordinator for the Colorado National Guard. "When aircraft go missing in the mountains, we usually find wreckage, debris, some indication of what happened. This helicopter looks like it was parked there deliberately, but there's no logical explanation for why or how." The helicopter's black box and flight recorder were immediately sent to the National Transportation Safety Board for analysis. The data showed that the aircraft had been operating normally up until the moment it disappeared from radar. Engine performance was within normal parameters, there were no mechanical failures, and Captain Reynolds had shown no signs of distress in his final communications. More puzzling was the fact that the helicopter had somehow traveled 40 miles beyond its last known radar position without being detected by any of the numerous tracking systems in the area. The flight path recorded by the GPS system ended abruptly at the point where the aircraft vanished from radar, with no indication of how it had reached the clearing where it was found. As investigators combed through the evidence, They began to uncover disturbing details about the days leading up to the flight. Sarah Morrison's colleagues at the hospital reported that she had seemed unusually anxious in the weeks before the trip, asking strange questions about what would happen to her patients if she were suddenly unable to care for them. One nurse remembered Sarah saying something about making sure everything was in order, in a way that seemed odd at the time. David Morrison's business partner, Michael Chen, revealed that David had been asking unusual questions about the company's financial structure and his insurance policies. David had also made some seemingly casual inquiries about how the business would continue if something happened to him. At the time, Chen had assumed David was just being cautious, but in retrospect, these conversations took on a more ominous tone. The twins' teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, remembered that Emma and Sophie had been unusually quiet in the days before the flight. They had turned in assignments that seemed to have a theme of saying goodbye, though their teacher hadn't thought much of it at the time. Emma had written a story about a family going on a magical journey, while Sophie had drawn pictures of people disappearing into clouds. Captain Reynolds's background also revealed some concerning details. Financial records showed that his helicopter tour business was struggling, with significant debt and declining bookings. His ex-wife, Patricia, told investigators that James had been under enormous stress and had mentioned feeling trapped by his financial obligations. However, she insisted that he would never do anything to harm his passengers or abandon his responsibilities. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Reynolds's mechanic, Robert Martinez, came forward with disturbing information. Martinez revealed that Reynolds had asked him to perform some unusual modifications to the helicopter in the weeks before the flight. These modifications weren't illegal, but they were uncommon and seemed designed to make the aircraft harder to track using standard radar systems. Martinez also revealed that Reynolds had been asking strange questions about survival in mountain wilderness, including what supplies would be necessary for a family to survive for extended periods in remote areas. Reynolds had claimed he was researching for a survival training course he was thinking of offering, but Martinez had found the questions oddly specific and persistent. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Phone records showed that Reynolds had been in contact with someone using encrypted communication apps in the days before the flight. The messages were heavily coded, but investigators were able to determine that they involved discussions of a relocation and references to a new beginning for multiple people. Bank records revealed that Reynolds had been moving money in small amounts to accounts that couldn't be easily traced. While the amounts weren't large enough to fund a completely new life, they suggested someone who was trying to build a financial cushion without attracting attention. More concerning was the discovery that David Morrison had also been making similar financial moves, liquidating investments and moving money to accounts that weren't connected to his normal banking patterns. The breakthrough in the case came when a hiker discovered a cache of supplies hidden in a cave system approximately 10 miles from where the helicopter had been found. The cache contained enough food, water, and survival gear to sustain 5 people for several weeks. The supplies were carefully organized and showed signs of recent use, but there was no indication of who had placed them there or when they had been accessed. Inside the cave, investigators found additional evidence that suggested the Morrison family's disappearance had been planned in advance. There were maps of the area marked with routes that avoided main trails and populated areas. Medical supplies were present, including prescription medications that matched those used by Sarah Morrison and her daughters. Most telling was a handwritten note in David Morrison's handwriting that read, "If anyone finds this, know that we chose this path because we couldn't see any other way forward." The discovery of the cave cache led to the revelation of a conspiracy that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. Further investigation revealed that Captain Reynolds had been involved with a group that helped people disappear from their old lives and start fresh in remote locations. The group operated under the guise of a survival training organization, but their real purpose was to facilitate elaborate disappearances for people who felt trapped by their circumstances. David Morrison had apparently discovered this organization through his research into architectural projects in remote areas. Financial pressures from his business, combined with what appeared to be serious marital problems that the family had kept hidden, had driven him to explore this drastic solution. Sarah Morrison had initially opposed the plan, but evidence suggested she had eventually agreed to participate, possibly to keep the family together. The plan had been months in the making. Reynolds would fly the family to a predetermined location, where they would be met by other members of the organization, and transported to a new location, where they could begin new lives with new identities. The helicopter would be left behind as a decoy, designed to make it appear that the family had simply vanished mysteriously, preventing any serious investigation into their actual whereabouts. But something had gone wrong with the plan. The cache of supplies in the cave had been disturbed, suggesting that the family had accessed them, but there was no indication of what had happened next. The organization that Reynolds had been working with seemed to have vanished as completely as the Morrison family, leaving investigators with no leads to follow. As the investigation continued, disturbing details about the Morrison family's real situation began to emerge. David's architectural firm was actually on the verge of bankruptcy, with debts that would have destroyed the family's financial future. Sarah had been dealing with severe depression following a patient's death at the hospital, and the twins had been struggling with academic and social problems that their parents had kept hidden from friends and extended family. The family had been living a carefully constructed facade of happiness and success, while privately dealing with problems that seemed insurmountable. The plan to disappear and start fresh in a new location had apparently seemed like their only escape from circumstances that were rapidly spinning out of control. But the investigation revealed that the organization Reynolds had been working with was not what it claimed to be. Rather than helping people start new lives, it appeared to be involved in more sinister activities. Financial records suggested that the group was actually engaged in human trafficking, using the promise of new identities and fresh starts to lure desperate families into situations where they could be exploited. The realization that the Morrison family might have been victims rather than willing participants in their own disappearance changed the entire focus of the investigation. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began coordinating efforts to track down the criminal organization that had apparently preyed on the family's desperation. The search for the Morrison family intensified, but the trail had grown cold. The organization had covered its tracks expertly, using sophisticated methods to hide their activities and the locations where they took their victims. The fact that the family had been missing for weeks meant that they could have been transported anywhere in the country, or even internationally. As the case gained national attention, similar disappearances began to come to light. Families from across the country had vanished under mysterious circumstances, often involving aircraft or other transportation methods that were later found abandoned. The pattern suggested a large-scale operation that had been operating for years, preying on families who were facing financial, legal, or personal crises. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing resources and expertise in tracking organized criminal networks. Agent Sarah Chen, a specialist in human trafficking cases, took over coordination of the multi-state investigation. Her team began working to identify other victims of the organization and track down the people responsible for the Morrison family's disappearance. The investigation revealed that the organization had been operating under multiple names and identities, using legitimate businesses as fronts for their criminal activities. Reynolds' helicopter tour company had been just one of many operations they used to gain access to potential victims. The group had been particularly effective at targeting families who were isolated by their problems and unlikely to have strong support networks that would immediately investigate their disappearance. But the breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for came from an unexpected source. A former member of the organization, a man named Thomas Clark, came forward with information about the group's operations. Clark had been involved in the logistics of moving people from pickup points to holding facilities, and he knew details about the organization's methods and locations. Clark revealed that the Morrison family had been taken to a compound in a remote area of Utah, where they were being held along with other families who had been lured into the organization's trap. The compound was designed to look like a legitimate survival training facility, but it was actually a prison where families were forced to work under harsh conditions while the organization profited from their labor. The information provided by Clark allowed law enforcement to plan a coordinated raid on the compound. The operation involved FBI agents, local law enforcement, and specialized tactical teams trained in hostage rescue situations. The raid was planned for dawn to maximize the element of surprise and minimize the risk to any victims who might be held at the facility. The compound was located in a canyon system that was virtually inaccessible, except by helicopter or a treacherous mountain road. The isolation had made it perfect for the organization's purposes, but it also made the rescue operation extremely challenging. Weather conditions and the remote location meant that the rescue teams had only one chance to succeed. As the sun rose over the Utah desert, helicopters carrying the rescue teams approached the compound. What they found exceeded their worst fears. The facility housed not just the Morrison family, but dozens of other victims who had been reported missing over the past several years. The conditions were horrific, with families living in overcrowded buildings and forced to work in dangerous conditions for the organization's profit. The Morrison family was found alive but severely traumatized by their months in captivity. Sarah Morrison had lost significant weight and was suffering from malnutrition and untreated medical conditions. David Morrison showed signs of physical abuse and psychological trauma. The twins, Emma and Sophie, had been separated from their parents for weeks and were in a state of severe psychological distress. The rescue operation was successful, but the physical and psychological damage to the victims was extensive. The Morrison family, along with the other rescued victims, required immediate medical attention and long-term psychological support. The organization had not only held them captive, but had systematically broken down their sense of identity and hope for the future. Captain Reynolds was found at the compound, but he was not the willing participant investigators had initially believed him to be. Reynolds had apparently been coerced into participating in the scheme through threats to his family and financial blackmail. He had been as much a victim of the organization as the Morrison family, forced to lure other families into the trap to protect his own loved ones. The leaders of the organization were arrested and charged with multiple counts of human trafficking, kidnapping, and racketeering. The investigation revealed that the group had been operating for over a decade, victimizing hundreds of families across the country. The scope of their operations was staggering, involving multiple states and potentially international connections. The Morrison family's return to their normal lives was a long and difficult process. The trauma they had experienced had changed them fundamentally, and rebuilding their relationships with each other and with the outside world required extensive therapy and support. The twins, in particular, struggled with the psychological impact of their experience, requiring specialized treatment for childhood trauma. Sarah Morrison returned to her work at the hospital, but she found it difficult to focus on her patients while dealing with her own recovery. She became an advocate for other trafficking victims, using her experience to help law enforcement understand the psychological impact of such crimes. Her work helped improve the support systems available to other victims and their families. David Morrison's architectural firm had collapsed during his absence, but he slowly began to rebuild his career with the support of colleagues and friends who had never given up hope for his return. He found that his experience had given him a new perspective on what was truly important in life, and he focused on creating designs that emphasized safety and security for families. The twins, Emma and Sophie, required years of therapy to overcome the trauma of their experience. They had missed months of school and had to work hard to catch up with their peers, but they also showed remarkable resilience, eventually becoming advocates for other child victims of trafficking and using their experience to help prevent other families from falling into similar traps. The case of the Morrison family's disappearance and rescue became a landmark in the fight against human trafficking. The investigation revealed the sophisticated methods used by criminal organizations to prey on vulnerable families, and the rescue operation demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation in combating such crimes. The helicopter that had been found in the Colorado mountains became a symbol of the case, representing both the deception used by the criminals and the determination of law enforcement to find the truth. The aircraft was eventually returned to Reynolds, who sold it and used the proceeds to establish a foundation that provides support to trafficking victims and their families. The organization responsible for the Morrison family's disappearance was ultimately dismantled, with its leaders receiving lengthy prison sentences. But the case highlighted the ongoing threat posed by similar groups and the need for continued vigilance in protecting vulnerable families from such predators. Years later, the Morrison family continued to rebuild their lives, drawing strength from their shared experience and their determination to help others avoid the trap they had fallen into. Their story became a powerful reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and human resilience can prevail, and that the bonds of family can survive even the most traumatic experiences. The case also led to significant changes in how law enforcement investigates missing persons cases, particularly those involving aircraft or other transportation methods. The Morrison family's experience demonstrated the importance of looking beyond the obvious explanations and considering the possibility that disappearances might be the result of organized criminal activity rather than accidents or voluntary departures. The mountain clearing where the helicopter was found became a place of pilgrimage for the Morrison family, who returned there annually to remember their ordeal and celebrate their survival. The remote location that had once represented their disappearance into nightmare had become a symbol of their return to hope and the possibility of healing from even the most traumatic experiences. Their story served as a warning to other families about the dangers of being lured into schemes that promise easy solutions to complex problems, while also demonstrating the importance of maintaining hope even in the most desperate circumstances. The Morrison family's experience showed that with courage, determination, and support from others, it is possible to survive even the most horrific ordeals and rebuild a meaningful life. The impact of their case extended far beyond their own family, leading to improved protections for other potential victims and better coordination between law enforcement agencies in tracking down criminal organizations that prey on vulnerable families. Their courage in speaking out about their experience helped save other families from similar fates and contributed to a broader understanding of the tactics used by human traffickers. As the years passed, the Morrison family found that their shared trauma had actually strengthened their bonds with each other and given them a deeper appreciation for the simple joys of everyday life. They had learned that true security comes not from material success or perfect circumstances, but from the love and support of family and the determination to face whatever challenges life might bring. The helicopter that had carried them into nightmare and eventually back to hope remained a powerful symbol of their journey, reminding them that even when the future seems uncertain and the path ahead is unclear, it is possible to find the strength to keep moving forward and to build a new life from the wreckage of the old one. Their story became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of family bonds to survive even the most extreme circumstances. The Morrison family's experience showed that while criminals might be able to take away freedom, security, and even hope for a time, they cannot ultimately destroy the fundamental human capacity for survival, recovery, and renewal. The case of the Morrison family's disappearance and rescue remains one of the most significant human trafficking cases in recent history, serving as both a warning about the dangers that vulnerable families face and an inspiration about the possibility of survival and recovery even from the most traumatic experiences. Their courage in rebuilding their lives and helping others has ensured that their ordeal was not in vain, and their story continues to provide hope to other families facing similar challenges. Note, this story is entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.